What is up, my bodyweight warriors, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about these guys, how we can strengthen the wrists when it comes to bodyweight training, and most importantly, handstands. But if you have weak wrists in general, then a lot of these recommendations are going to help you out as well. So let's jump into kind of the recommended rough routine I've got for you here. This is actually pretty much my personal routine that I use when it comes to warming up for handstands or bodyweight training sessions. And I found that over the years, I've taken things out, added things in, and this seems to have been what is stuck for the longest period of time. And I think it sets you in good stint when it comes to strengthening those wrists. Because when it comes to bodyweight training, it is quite unusual because we go from not standing on our hands to standing on our hands in a variety of things, whether it's to do push-ups, whether it's to do handstands, whether it's to do dips. There's a lot of force that generally goes through the wrists, and it happens all of a sudden. And that is actually a recipe for creating injuries. When we have a dramatic increase in load in a very short space of time, that's when we see injuries arise. So it's important to look after these guys, because if you want to do anything when it comes to handstands, you're going to need them. So without further ado, let's jump into the routine. So I'm going to kick off this routine. We're going to start off with some mobilizations. This is just sort of some light movements just to increase the range of motion of which our wrists can move, and also just get things warmed up for actually the strengthening part of things. The first exercise, we're going to look at increasing wrist extension. And for this, we're going to be using an exercise that I like to call clock walks. So to perform this, we're going to start in a kneeling position on the floor, hands facing forward. So here we're going to have the hands in what would be a 12 o'clock position if we're doing it on an imaginary clock face. From here, we're going to walk the hands outwards at 3-hour intervals. And then we're going to move all the way around to 6 o'clock. We're going to walk it round, and then we're going to hold that 6 o'clock position for a little bit. We're then going to reverse that motion. We're going to go back to 3 or 9 o'clock, going back to 12 o'clock, and then we're going to start turning the hands inwards until we again reach that 6 o'clock position. And this time we're going to be in a maximally internally rotated position. So the stretch is going to move slightly to the outside of the forearm. Again, we're going to pause in this position, and then we can walk our way back around, and we can go back through this between 3 and 5 times. Kind of depends on what feels good. Over the period of completing each of these sort of walk rotations, we're going to try and load a little bit more weight on the wrist. So start off with the first one a little bit lighter, and then as you do 1 or 2 more, start to place a little bit more load through the hands. But ultimately, this exercise is a warm-up, so we shouldn't be pushing it too much anyway. Next, we move on to warming up the wrists in flexion. So for this one, we're going to do some finger curls. So this one's very simply, we're going to place our hands, fingers facing each other and the palms facing up on the floor. A mat is useful for this one because it can be a little bit uncomfortable if you have a particularly hard floor. From here, essentially, all we're going to do is we're going to try and curl our fingers up as far as we can. We're going to hold it briefly, and then we're going to uncurl them. And we're simply going to repeat that for about 12 to 15 repetitions. It's going to stretch out that wrist in flexion, but it's also going to help warm up and wake up a lot of those muscles that are involved in causing the wrist to flex on the forearm, which we're going to be using in lace training, whether it's doing handstands or whatever else we come to do. So I'd recommend going back and forth between each of these exercises just for 2 sets, very simply. The first one, 3 to 5 walks around the clock, and then the second one, 12 to 15 reps. And at this point, that we're feeling a little bit more warmed up, and we can then jump into the strengthening exercises. The first strengthening exercise is by far my favorite one, and I think the best one. If you're going to take one exercise away from this whole video, this exercise should be it, and that is the first knuckle push-up. For this exercise, we're going to start in that similar starting position, just on our knees, hands on the floor, and then all we're going to do here is we're going to try and raise the heels of our hands up, but we're going to keep the first knuckle right at the base of the fingers connected to the ground. So we're going to create a stretch over the fingers. We're going to contract some of those forearm flexors, but generally we're going to be working on strengthening that wrist in and out of extension. I would recommend pushing up, pausing for a second or 2, and then trying to lower under some control. So actually controlling the eccentric and lowering for about 2 to 3 seconds. Now this position is the easiest position to do, kneeling with our hands directly underneath our shoulders. What we can do initially, if we're trying to create a little bit more range of motion in the wrist, is we can start to lean the shoulders forward slightly and increase the angle on the wrist. This way we're not adding any more load to our wrist, but we are going to be helping to increase that range of motion. Once we get a little bit more comfortable here, we can actually start to increase the load in which we're doing this exercise. We can do this by moving the base of support that we have our legs on, so at the moment it'll be the knees, further away from our hands. So the first step would be to move the knees back, and eventually we'll move into a full-on plank position to perform the first knuckle push-ups. But just as a warning, I would recommend doing this over the period of a couple of months, 2 or 3 months. I wouldn't recommend doing this in a space of 2 to 3 workouts. It's going to be far too much, far too soon. This exercise isn't about intensity. It's not about doing things really hard. It's just about doing it consistently and then letting that strength build up over time. I would recommend performing these first knuckle push-ups for anywhere between 10 to 12 repetitions. The next exercise is going to be looking at strengthening the wrist in flexion. So we're going to be using something called the wrist push-up. So for this one, we're going to start again in the same sort of position we started in those mobilization exercises. We're going to start on this one again on our knees, but this time we're going to place our knuckles on the ground with our fists clenched. Try to do is keep our fists clenched, and we're going to let the wrist roll out so we roll onto the backs of the hand. And all we're going to do is we're going to reverse that motion. So we push back up, we squeeze the fingers just like the first mobilization drill to then pull ourselves back onto that knuckle position. And this would be a wrist push-up. Just like the first strengthening exercise, we can do this in this position, the easiest position. As we feel more comfortable, we can place more load onto the wrist. So we would do this by, again, moving the support of the legs further away from the hand. So first of all, we'd move the knees further back, and eventually we'd work up to doing these in a full push-up position. Again, taking months, not just sessions to get to that point. As I said, you can do this one for 10 to 12 repetitions. So the final exercise to finish this up, we're going to do a little bit of work in deviation. This is when the wrist moves from side to side. This is an important range of motion to strengthen, especially if we're going to be using parallettes or parallel bars. This will help condition a lot of the muscular on the forearm, which goes along with that. For this exercise, all you're going to need is a long stick, or you're going to need a dumbbell, which you can take the weights off one side. Either or will work very nicely. First, we're going to train radial deviation, and this is when we get a shortening on the thumb side of the wrist. Stand holding the weight by our side, letting the arms relax straight down, and then all we're going to do here is we're going to try and lift that weight or lift the stick towards the sky. So this we're going to shorten in radial deviation. We're going to hold that for a second or two, and then again, we're just going to lower for a second or two. It's not a particularly large range of motion, but it doesn't necessarily need to. We just need to make sure we're going to be working that radial deviations. And we can perform this for actually a total of between 20 and 30 repetitions. We want to get a little bit more repetitions on this one. Then to perform the ulnar variation of this, we're just going to switch around where we're holding this. So you're going to swap the dumbbell around, or you're going to hold the opposite end of the stick so it's pointing now behind you. And then again, we're going to perform the same movement. Let the gravity do its work, pulling the stick down. And then we're going to lift it up, and we're going to try and think about touching the stick or touching the dumbbell to the back of our arm, the tricep. And again, lift up, pause for a second, lower under control, perform for 20 to 30 repetitions. Just as a note, ulnar will generally be stronger than radial deviation. So it's worth doing the radial first, the ulnar second. Perform all the reps on one side, perform all the reps on the other side, or if you have 2 sticks, 2 dumbbells, you can pretend you're going skiing and perform both at the same time. Whatever floats your boat. But that is basically the strength work. Again, I'd recommend performing this for 2, maybe 3 sets. I'd probably perform 1 to 2 sets just as a warm-up before your session. And then if you wanted to work on some extra conditioning, say you're getting into handstands or bodyweight training and you wanted to make sure your wrists were nice and strong, I would do a couple of sets at the end of your session just to support a little bit more blood flow to the wrist and strengthening of those areas. Doing the training in general, doing the handstands, doing the bodyweight training, that's also going to help support strengthening your wrist. This is just something you can do additionally to help increase the focus on it, just to make sure we don't get any of those nasty injuries, which, ultimately the best way to make no results is to get injured and not train. So there's that. If you're going to give this a go, let me know in the comment section down below. Let me know if you're going to give this routine a go, or alternatively, what is your favorite exercise for strengthening the wrists? Let me know. While you're down there as well, you can also just hit that thumbs up button and support the channel. Right next to it is that subscribe button if you want to join the Bodyweight Warrior tribe and not miss out any more future videos. But that has basically been it for this week, guys. I'll catch you in the next episode. Have a strong week and peace.